The NFL implemented a ton of rule changes over the past week or so, and we talk about how they both help or hurt the Ravens. All that and more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher, Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every single day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your podcasts, for 5 days a week plus more of Ravens content. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with only $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We're back here. It's a Sunday. We had another bonus episode of this show on Saturday. Back here today again, as promised. I did promise this, talking about the NFL rule changes, but this might actually be the hardest challenge I have had on Locked On Ravens to date. Almost 5 years hosting this show. I'm not sure there's going to be another challenge harder than this. The reason being, I am very under the weather. So I apologize if I sound stuffy or there are cuts here and there. It's just, it's something that I promised to do. And under normal circumstances, probably wouldn't have done this, got on here. But again, for me, it's sort of like, hey, I promised to do this. I'm going to do it. So we're going to power through this here. And I'm excited to talk about these rule changes, but I'm going to pour everything I have into this episode. So let's try to keep the talking here. It's a talking show, but we're going to try to get through this here with as little hiccups as possible. So we're going to talk about everything from the hip drop tackles, the new kickoff today, getting into the challenge rule as well. So let's dive into it. The NFL, again, rule changes galore coming up. And some of them I think are very interesting and intriguing. Other ones, maybe not so much. So they actually give the team, there's an article here, and I'm excited to read it out. So first, we'll just go through every single rule. Then we'll talk about some of them in depth and how they either help or hurt the Ravens. And sometimes it'll be both. So first of all, Detroit here. Now, you can challenge a third time following one successful challenge. I like this rule personally. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Now, the competition committee, there is an offensive foul that allows for an enforcement of a major foul by the offense prior to a change of possession in a situation where there are fouls by both teams. That's an interesting one. Now, another competition committee one is to include a ruling of a pass or down by contact or to balance before throwing a pass as a reviewable play. Look, I think any time that you can review something, I know the pass interference thing didn't really work out all that well, but I think if you have everything is reviewable, I know it might slow down the game, and I think that's what the NFL is trying to avoid. But I hate seeing games that are decided by the referees and there's no option to review a play. Again, I get the pass interference thing didn't work, but I think adding things that are reviewable is a good idea. Now, number 4 here, another competition committee. Now there are allowing replay reviews when there is a clear and obvious visual evidence that the game clock expired before any snap. I like that a lot. We have seen time and time again, there have been games that have been decided by something like that, or it's a huge momentum swing. So I think that adding, again, reviewable, I'm all for reviewable. I don't necessarily, I get it slows down the game a little bit, but in my opinion, I think that's fine if you can get the call right. Now, here is the hip drop tackle one. The competition committee eliminates the potentially dangerous tackling technique, obviously then called the hip drop tackle. We'll get into that a little more. Now, for 1 year only, number 6, there's a new form of a free kick play that's designed to resemble a typical scrimmage play by aligning players on both teams closer and restricting movement to reduce space and speed. And number 2, to promote more returns, permits replay official automatically reviewed whether a free kick is legal to touch to the ground on a receiving team player landing in the zone. So we'll talk about this kickoff rule a little bit too, because with Justin Tucker and the way the Ravens value special teams, very, very interesting. Now, another one from Detroit. Here's one that provides clubs with an unlimited number of designated for return transactions into the postseason. I like that one too. There used to be restrictions on that. I think teams being able to return guys, I'm all for it. Number 8, Pittsburgh here moves the trade deadline to Tuesday after week 9 game. So I believe if I'm not mistaken, that pushes it back. I would need to look, but I think that does push it back. And if that is the case, I do like that one. Number 9, competition committee permits each club to place a maximum of 2 players who are placed on an applicable reserve list on the business day of the final roster reduction will be designated for return. Such players will immediately count as 2 of the club's total designations. I like that one because, again, we saw it with guys like Keaton Mitchell, Malik Ham last year. You had to have them on the 53-man. Now you don't have to necessarily do that. I like that one a lot. Number 10, competition committee expand the standard elevation rules to permit clubs to elevate a bona fide quarterback in a limited number of times from his practice squad to his active list, but be emergency third quarterback. Emergency third quarterback. There we go. So this is something the NFL obviously experimented with last year, and I think it's a really good idea. Number 11, here's Buffalo. To make injury reporting rules for players who do not travel with their clubs to games away for their home competitively fair as well. And number 12 by Jacksonville expands the 2023 preseason trial, providing a specific Hawkeye feed in the coach's boost for 2024 preseason with full implementation for the 2025 season. I like that one too. I don't really hate any of these. I mean, we'll talk about the hip drop tackle. I do have some opinions on that one, but for the most part, it's mostly about reviewing, and I get the kickoff rule is going to be an adjustment. It's going to be an adjustment for me for sure. I mean, look, we've all been growing up, or, most people here have been growing up with that kickoff rule being what it is, where you get the full speed collisions, guys running down the field. But as the game has gone on, and we'll get to this more a little bit in the final part of the show, it's more of just boot the ball out of the end zone, doesn't make for as exciting of a kickoff. And I think the NFL, while having player safety as a really important reason, they also just want to make the game more exciting. But again, we'll get to that more in the final part of the show. I think the one that I want to kind of get into a little bit here before we head into our first break is the third challenge rule. It wouldn't be fair for some of these challenges from NFL teams to be decided by officials, where they make a terrible call and all of a sudden you have to challenge a play, and sometimes don't even get it right on the replay. And it's like, okay, well, what do you want me to do here with this challenge? Allowing teams an extra challenge, I think, is a good thing. It just allows teams to get things right? That to me is a really important part of the game. Come up in the second part of the show, we'll talk more about the hip drop tackle, though there are a lot of misconceptions about it. We'll talk about if that can help or hurt the Ravens as well. Stay tuned, plan to talk about on Locked On Ravens. First, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Now, again, I have UConn, and my bracket is all but busted. And honestly, I don't even think it matters anymore. So visit FanDuel.com/lockdown to bet on college hoops so they cut down the nets. We're back for our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this Sunday. Really appreciate everybody tuning into this bonus episode of the show, making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. Again, we're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your shows. So 5 days a week, plus this bonus content here of Ravens news, analysis, updates, and more. Let's keep talking about these rule changes, though, because there were a lot of them passed, but I think there's controversy as to which one was the bigger one or the more controversial one in general. But I do think the hip drop tackle is one that caused a lot of controversy from current and former players, specifically defenders. Now, we did see some offensive players come out in support of the rule. Kenyon Drake, former Raven, who it's an interesting name to pull out there, but he was for it, considering that he had an injury that happened on a hip drop. John Harbaugh also said that he was all in favor of removing it. But then you have others, J.J. Watt, Patrick Queen, a bunch of defenders who were coming out and saying, well, can't wait for two-hand touch, can't wait for, me to get penalized for every single thing I do defensively. And I think that both sides have a point. I think it both helps and hurts the Ravens. Now, both sides have a point because player safety should be at the top of the list for the NFL. It 100% should be. And the hip drop tackle, while it is a dangerous play, I do think this would be less of a controversial point if there were less things being policed out of defense already. It's already so hard. It's already so hard to play defense at the NFL level. And for players, and this is getting into a Ravens perspective now, players like Derrick Henry, it's like, right, if you're a smaller defender, how are you going to drag down a guy like Derrick Henry? Now, the definition of a hip drop tackle. The NFL defines hip drop tackle as a defender who grabs the runner with both hands or wraps with both arms and then weights himself by swiveling and dropping his hips in or landing on and trapping the runner's legs. So a lot of people use the Mark Andrews injury, the Logan Wilson play, to define hip drop, but I think others, I'm not sure that's to the exact definition. You look at Tony Pollard in San Francisco, there are a bunch of others as well. But again, it's like, how are defenders going to tackle? I mean, Derrick Henry, he's a guy where this helps Baltimore because it's like, well, how are you going to try to tackle a guy who is that big of a human being? He is a massive human. And, if you're trying to get him down and you're a smaller defender, well, you're going to try to use all your weight to bring him down. Now, the negative side of this is that I think for bigger running backs like a Derrick Henry, and even if you wanted to, you could maybe throw a guy like Gus Edwards in this conversation, who's now on the Chargers and wearing number 4, by the way. Big number change for Gus, going from number 35 to 4. But it's going to make players now go for the legs, attack the knees, attack the ankles, and try to bring them down that way. Now, a typical, like a textbook NFL ankle tackle, good. I mean, again, you don't want to have the ankle twist or anything, but I think also the NFL is trying to get defenders to run through ball carriers instead of, going and trying to bring them down from behind, where if you kind of let a guy go past you and then kind of drag him down that way. But again, it's almost like, what do you do if a guy's behind you? Do you wrap him up? I mean, Derrick Henry, his strength, they're not going to pull him back. So I think in that way it benefits Baltimore. While it does take out the risk of injury in some ways, I do think it increases it in others. So I think it's kind of a two-way street for ball carriers, anybody with the ball in their hands. And the other part of this too is that it's not reviewable. So we talk about, I talked about it in the first segment, how I am for reviewing plays. I think, again, even if it slows down the game, you do have the opportunity to get things right. And I think that is more important, in my opinion. But we're going to have a lot of controversy this year. We're going to have a ton of controversy this year just based off of, let's say Derrick Henry gets brought down, but they don't call it a hip drop, even though the guy fits the definition because it's just barely not it. The Ravens are going to be mad. Or let's say that the defender does do the right job, and all of a sudden Derrick Henry gets 15 yards because they brought him down in a way that looked like it, but it's not. The opposing team's going to be mad. So in my opinion, Baltimore, the two-way street it is, look, it's going to cause the Ravens, I think, it's going to change how teams want to attack Baltimore because, again, one-on-one with Derrick Henry in the hole, you can't hip drop tackle him. Or one-on-one with Lamar Jackson, you can't kind of latch on. And I get this is for more of the more physical ball carriers, but again, Derrick Henry, it's like, how are you going to tackle him? That's kind of where my thinking is. But on the other side of the coin, Baltimore's defense is also going to be subjected to these rules. So obviously everybody, players like Roquan Smith, Justin Madubuike, Kyle Hamilton, how are they going to adjust? We're probably going to see a couple hip drop calls on every team this year, and that does not exclude the Ravens. Obviously, it includes them. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be whoever adjusts the quickest, and I think whoever adjusts the quickest is going to have the most competitive advantage. Plus, the carriers or the ball carriers who fit the description in terms of guys who you would normally try to use that tackle against, a bigger guy like Derrick Henry, that's going to benefit Baltimore in so many different ways. I don't even know how to describe it. I think it's going to be, again, you want to have player safety at the top of the list. This is not me saying, oh, well, yeah, this is such a competitive advantage. The reason the NFL is trying to do this is for a couple of reasons. Obviously, I think for the player safety aspect, but look, I think we can be honest about the whole thing. With the way that defense is being policed nowadays, it's going to result in more points. I mean, what sells? Remember that Rams-Chiefs game a while ago? What sells in today's NFL? It's points. What would you rather watch? That Rams-Chiefs game, what was it, like 54 to 51 or something? Or would you rather watch a 6-3 slobber knocker that has, everybody, defensive stand after defensive stand? What sells in the NFL is points. And while I'm not saying that was at the top of the NFL's list with this whole thing, it's going to result in points. It just 100% is. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the final part of the show as well, just diving a bit more into player safety and kickoffs, because again, explosiveness, fireworks, those things sell. Defensive stands, I think they are appreciated. Again, offense wins games, defense wins championships. That is still a true fact, but points are just, with those Ravens teams, Ravens team last year, let's even go there. When the Ravens are putting up 30-plus points a game, that was a lot more exciting for people than the Ravens putting up 16 points or 14 points. So points galore, I think is going to increase the total score. But again, player safety, I still think should be at the top of the NFL's list. And this rule will eliminate some of the dangerous tackles. But we're going to also, I think, see different ways players try to attack things. And maybe that will result in more injuries. Coming up in the final part of the show, we are going to review the NFL's kickoff rule. Obviously, special teams being a huge part of John Harbaugh and the Ravens' strategy over the years. Will it help Baltimore? Will it hurt them? Stay tuned. Plenty to talk about on this bonus episode of Locked On Ravens. Go back our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this Sunday, talking NFL rule changes in a bonus episode, how they help the Ravens, how they hurt the Ravens. Really appreciate everybody for tuning in. We're powering through here. Again, my biggest challenge here on Locked On Ravens might be this episode. I am very under the weather, very sick right now, and it's a whole bunch of combination of things: headache and throat and stomach and coughing and lungs on fire, everything. So I did promise this bonus episode I wanted to deliver on my promise, and that's what we're doing here. So we're going to talk in this final segment about the NFL and their new kickoff rule. Now, let's get into what the rule actually is. We'll scroll back up here on this article, and I'm trying to find it, but pretty much it's going to be big, where essentially the rule is to create a new form of a free kick play that's designed to, one, resemble a typical scrimmage play by aligning players on both teams closer together and restricting those movements to reduce space and speed, and to promote more returns, permits the replay official automatically reviewed whether a free kick legally touched the ground or a receiving team player is in the landing zone. So what that landing zone is, essentially, I think it's 10 yards, but you're going to have players, it's more so like a line of scrimmage where players are lining up, not next to each other, but 5 or 10 yards out. Instead of having opposing, both teams, you run down, Tucker would kick that ball, he'd boom it, and the Ravens would run down into the end zone. Now they're going to be a lot closer, and it's going to be a line of both the Ravens and their opponent. But the touchback is also moved up to the 35-yard line, not the 25-yard line. And so if you're the Ravens, if you had the Ravens defense last year, right? The Ravens' historic defense, tons of great plays and tons of great games by them, you will be fine with Justin Tucker kicking that ball out of the back of the end zone every single time, because the 25-yard line wasn't too crazy in terms of where the opposing offense would get the ball, and you would trust your defense to be like, all right, we think that the way the defense was playing, especially if you're the Ravens, you don't think that they're going to give up a ton of points if every single drive is started at the 25-yard line, their own 25-yard line. Now, with the touchback being at the 35, it's only 10 yards, but at the same time, that's a decently big difference. Maybe you can get into field goal range easier. And with that landing zone, it's going to create more opportunities for explosive plays, more opportunities for kickoff return touchdowns. And again, that is, I think, what the NFL wants, where player safety is going to be a huge thing. I think it does benefit Baltimore in a few different ways, but I also think it hurts them when it comes to the likelihood of the Ravens giving up a long return on this. And this was piloted in a couple of other leagues, so not necessarily the first time we've seen something like this, but at the same time, you do have to kind of wonder how it's all going to look. And it's going to take some adjusting and getting used to, because with the NFL moving the touchback out to the 25, but kind of keeping everything the same a couple of years ago, it incentivized teams to just boot it out of the back of the end zone and returners to just say, you know what, we're not going to return. Let's get those 5 extra yards, as opposed to risking great coverage and getting stopped at the 15 or the 10 or something like that. So again, going to be a massive adjustment for both the Ravens and every other team in the league. But all these different rules, again, I'm all for reviewing. I think the pass interference rule, even though it didn't really work, I mean, I still think it was a quality rule. Now, it does depend on judgment. I mean, this is going to be a complete judgment thing. All these are. We're not talking about robot officials here, right? We're talking about real human beings that have their own judgments. And maybe the way that you or I see something is not the way that the NFL referee sees something. And that leads to a difference in opinion, or that leads to something else that goes on. So, yeah, plenty of adjustments that are going to happen here over the course of really the entire year, because some of these rules are only pilots, right? They're only going to be in the game for a year, and then we're going to see how it all plays out, or they're going to get passed, and some of these are here to stay. So I think some of these rule changes do help the Ravens. Others do hurt them. I think the challenge rule is great for John Harbaugh, someone who we know can get aggressive with his challenges, so it gives him an extra opportunity. So it's things like that that can really make a difference. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Locked On Ravens Bonus Style. Really appreciate it. Coming up tomorrow, again, we'll be right back with our normally scheduled Monday through Friday content. So be sure to subscribe, follow along, video form, audio form. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.